We've got another amazing panel for you to talk about storytelling in a doc form and just storytelling in general. I think, as we've heard today, one of the most important things of why we all got into filmmaking was telling those impactful stories. And, what I want to go through in this panel discussion is how we can tell better stories no matter the form that we're in. And what I want to learn from the two of you is how we can share these stories with the audience and how we can convey those. So without further ado, let's introduce the two of you. Just kind of tell us, who you are and, what role you play in the filmmaking community. Christina, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Christina. I'm a cinematographer mostly. I direct a little bit, and I shoot everything, but mainly I've been shooting a lot of documentary in the past year.
Fantastic. Amanda?
Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Anman Wong, and I am a director. And I mostly work in documentary. I'm moving sort of around now into the narrative and commercial realm. But my documentary 2 years ago was the Best of Showcase at the Women in Film and Television. And I have a latest thing, the series on CBC Gem called DigiArt.
Amazing. So I'm very fascinated. How did you choose documentary filmmaking? I mean, that is, you can go into narrative we've talked about today. We've talked about commercials. But docs is where I started. And I mean, I love watching docs to this day. I find the things that I consume my time with the most on Netflix are docs. So how did you get into docs?
It was a mix of getting thrown into it and also the fact that I find it a lot easier just to create documentaries because you're just capturing already an existing story as opposed to trying to make it up and then build an entire environment. You're just trying to capture as authentically as possible what's already happening in the world around you. So you just need a good story and people in front of the camera telling it. But then I also I lived in Alberta for quite some time, and that's a really heavy documentary environment. So I just found myself doing a lot more documentary out there, whether it was nature-based, more tourism type-based, or I did a lot of work in Indigenous communities as well. So those were a lot of really interesting stories to just naturally cover out there as well.
What about you, Amanda? How did you get into the storytelling world?
Interesting, the very first film festival that I ever went to was the documentary film festival. It was Hot Docs. And from Hot Docs, I saw how cinematic documentary could be. It's not like, unscripted documentary, we're all within the same realm of nonfiction, but there's something very different than a documentary film and, a reality TV show. Both excellent, very, very skillful workers working on it, but very different worlds. So I saw there was a lot to explore there. Wanted to get into doing unscripted work. I worked at a production company for a couple of years, working in unscripted TV, then decided to go off on my own and decide to make my first documentary film, and then I kept making more, and here we are.
I love the stories behind doc filmmakers because most people started from either creating mini promo videos or weddings, or they maybe got right into docs. How did your careers, I guess, transition from, making a short film or short doc into, a feature film? How did that first feature film come to progression, I guess? Go ahead. Yeah.
I'll talk about the series, the CBC Gem one that I did, because that's almost feature-length altogether. We pitched it to CBC, and they liked it, and then we just went with it. It was your question, from the beginning? Or
so if you look back at your first doc that you made, what was that journey from then to CBC? Pitching to CBC, I mean, many of us in this room have probably looked at I want to get something on TV. Seems like a tall task. How do you get to that stage where you can get in a meeting with CBC and pitch them on a show?
Right. Great question. I feel like a lot of it is, and earlier on a panel, someone was also saying about your relationships in the industry, the people that you work with, how you tell your stories. With documentary, so much more important than in the fictional world is the decisions that you make as a person, your ethical decisions, the way you interact with real people. You need to be very intentional about the way that you're working with things, very thoughtful, and these are real people's stories that you're telling, so you can't just twist them and turn them into what you want. So you have to really practice this listening and working collaboratively with people. Over time, every documentary that you do, I feel like for myself, I'll speak for myself, I learned a lot from the people around me, from the crew that I worked with. Every new crew that I worked with, I learned something new. Every new subject I worked with, I learned something new. And slowly you get to the point where you meet enough people that they'll start to commission you for other documentary ideas. So the film that that received the Best of Showcase at WIFT, that was a commissioned film that someone reached out to me and said, I would like to commission this film about, a neighborhood in Toronto. Can you pitch me an idea? And I pitched a neighborhood that was very close to my heart, East Chinatown. And you kind of have to tell stories that you vibe with, that you know. Like, I'm not going to go tell a story about someone else's story that I don't understand. And maybe there's a lot of research that you can do to get into it, but it's at the heart of documentary. You as the director are part of that heart, and you have to really believe in your subject and the stories that you're telling in order to have it shine through. And then eventually people will see that.
I love it.
I just want to follow up on some of the things. As a cinematographer as well, there's already a bias in what you're choosing to leave out of the frame as a cinematographer, so I take great responsibility in that. So I try my best to be very perceptive of what's going on outside of my little frame, because if I'm leaving something out that's vital to the story, then I'm doing a disservice to that story and that person and that subject matter. But at the end of the day, I also don't get to make those final decisions, so there's a lot of trust in the director once I've covered what I've done in my job, that they're going to tell the story from what I've captured in the most authentic way too. So sometimes you end up seeing the cut and you're kind of like, oh, that's not what happened, or that's not what I thought we were doing. But mostly I just try to capture what I'm seeing as authentically as possible, so that they have more decisions to be that ethical in the editing floor.
Now, when you look at cinematography in a doc world versus commercial, they're almost polar opposites of one another. I mean, in the commercial world, the focus is the image. That's the main focus. But in the doc world, the focus is making sure that the story is told in the best way possible. So how do you as a cinematographer make images that are pretty, but still get through the day of a documentary?
I actually do a lot of commercial documentary too, so it's an interesting combination hybrid, because obviously we're selling a product, so it's not going to be as true to, the person's not all of a sudden just having an interview about how they love banking with TD while they're but so you try to it's going to be more stylized, it's going to be more lit in what it might naturally look like in that perspective, but it's being presented in the end result as a commercial, so people understand that. Whereas in documentary world, again, I light everything I shoot, even if it doesn't look like it's lit. I've lit it, because opening a window or closing a curtain, that's lighting. So any decision I make, dimming lights, covering something, that's still lighting. And I try to make everything I do motivated, no matter what. So if I know I'm moving around a space, I have 5 seconds sometimes when I walk in a room to decide if I have to close a door, because a lot of action is going to be happening over here by a kitchen, and I need to make sure I can get into that zone and they're lit, because I might not have enough time to throw up a light. So there's a lot of things I have to make decision-wise in a very quick amount of time, but just so that I don't miss a moment, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it looks pretty. If I miss something vital to the story, then what's the point of me even being there? So the story is what you're serving always in documentary. It doesn't matter if it looks pretty. If you miss it on camera, then there's no point of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have that ability to retake. So I mean, from a directing standpoint, how do you make sure you capture the story as authentically as possible, but also tell the story of a film that you get the message across?
It's a great question. I learned a lot from unscripted TV. Before even going to shoot anything, you have extensive calls and chats with your subjects, the people that you're speaking with. You ask them to tell me the story of your life. Tell me what this means to you. And, I would have, 3-hour-long calls with the subject. And just to hear how they speak, what they're passionate about, where is the story here from how they want to tell it. And then once I know that, then I can go and do my own prep. And I can write down this topic, ask them about this topic on camera, this topic, this topic, this topic, because I know that they'll speak passionately about those things and maybe avoid this thing, and this thing. For me, and every documentary director, I think, works differently. For me, I have a very heavy prep that I do. So I actually write up I guess you could call it like a shooting script. So I'll write the script in an audio and visual like order, visual on one side, audio on the other. I write up how I think I want this to work in a general sense. And so in this section, I kind of want my subject to talk about A, B, C. So then I make sure that I go and ask questions in the interview that I can use for A, B, and C. And maybe once we get into the edit, things will change and it doesn't work the way that you want it to come out. But at the very least, you know that you have the coverage of the things that you want them to talk about. And you've sort of pre-planned or you've thought how you want to display that in the structure of your film or your series or your episode.
From Amanda's research, then I come in, I would be a cinematographer, and I'd be like, okay, what did you learn? Tell me everything. What are we trying to capture here? Because that's my job now, is to, from her research, try to translate the story on screen so I know what to go after. So not all directors do that level of work, though, so that's what I appreciate about Amanda. So a lot of times we're having conversations
together.
Yeah.
Important.
So it's like a lot of times we're having conversation of like look, style, feel of the film, but at the end of the day, what's the story? What are the beats? What are the important things we're going after? It could be even as far as like, are we trying to be more verite where I'm just moving around capturing things, or am I supposed to be more a fly on the wall, wide shots, sitting in a corner, letting things happen? So that's when I kind of know. So when I'm cut loose, I can do my thing, because there's a lot of times where they can't be behind my shoulder telling me what they want. So there's a trust there that we've talked enough that when I get into a room, sometimes it's just me and the sound person, and they're in another room watching on a tear deck, and I'm just doing whatever we discussed to get the film in the bag, or what's happening in the bag in the way that we discussed it. So that's really important to do prep, even in things that are a bit more impromptu.
And how do you make those decisions when you're going on to set and saying like, hey, like we're gonna capture this today, and then all of a sudden something major happens in your documentary? Because I mean, that's always part for the course. How do you plan on that pivot on the day, and what do you do to prepare for that with the crew and with yourself as the director?
Yeah, things always happen. I always go into every set thinking at least one or two things are going to change, are going to be terrible today, and just going in with that mindset and already going into the mindset of how do I problem solve something if something comes up, having a plan B, a plan C, and having trust with, your cinematographer, like Christina said, your crew, to know that if we can pivot in this way, and having those discussions beforehand. And I've been in a situation before where, I've gotten everything together, we've driven 3 hours out to the location, and the subject cancels. So then what do? Okay, maybe we can shoot some B-roll, right? And maybe we can shoot some things around the area that would tell their story if we get to go back to them to talk about things. Or maybe there's other things in the area that we could shoot that would relate to some other subjects in the documentary. Maybe the subject canceled because they're having a bad hair day, but they still want to talk about things. So maybe we go to their house and we record audio so that at least we can use that as VO over some other things of them doing stuff when they have a better hair day. So these are the things that I think about sometimes when the problems come up. And every problem is solvable, I think.
And I'm curious from a cinematography standpoint, is your preference to film docs with one camera or two?
It depends on the project. Usually, a lot of stuff I do is a one camera thing, but if it's interviews, then there'll be a second camera for cutting into, especially sit down interviews. Kind of boring if it's just one shot the whole time, and it allows the editor and the director to cut up things a lot nicer if there's another angle. Yeah, but I mean, if there's a lot of action going on, it does make sense to have a second camera person. So a lot of times how it works is I'll have my second cam op be shooting a lot of the wider shots, and then I'll run around and shoot more of the complicated, weird, interesting texture moments that I know what to look for, because to have my second cam op have that responsibility is not fair, because that's not their job, like to make those creative decisions. It's mine. So they're my safety shot, so that there's always an in and out of every scene. So for example, like I could have someone sitting, shooting a 2-shot, when I can just run back and forth, getting different angles from people talking, and cover everybody in close-ups, but we always have that 2-shot safety of of them if they move or whatever. So that happens a lot in things that I film. So it does make it easier. But when I am a single camera, I like to shoot on primes a lot too. So that I like to make myself really challenge myself as much as possible a lot of times. So I'll pick a nice lens.
Have like this like secret hang language too, right? Where you're like this to communicate with each other.
I feel like a baseball player because I'm like
Yeah.
and then working with my sound person too, they're like walking around me and we're trying to talk. So like a lot of times we're like doing hand signals or like, but when you also like work with people enough, they just understand you. Like I even have like focus pullers that like, a couple of them in the audience right now that if I shift a certain way, they know I'm going in. Like we have weird language and body language that we tell each other so we don't have to speak. So we're gonna be on the same level. And you just get that from like working with people. And especially when you're traveling, like the person you're traveling with is literally going to be with you 24/7, and you're going through some tough situations sometimes. So like who you're paired with is going to make or break your film too as a crew person. Like if you and your sound person don't get along, that's a pretty tough shoot to last a few months on in some really chaotic situations, because traveling alone is already hectic itself. So it's all about trust behind the camera and just paying attention to each other when you're moving and operating stuff. And then she's got her own separate thing of trust as a director with the subject. So we kind of just have to honor whatever they have built together, and then she has to trust me to get what we've discussed.
And when you guys are going into post-production, you know, we've talked about how important the prep is. How involved is the cinematographer in the post of something like a documentary? Are you getting involved with any of the decisions? Are you working collaboratively, or are you working strictly with the editor in that situation?
Do you want to take this one first?
On TV shows, I don't have as much say beyond color grade. So like I just did Dark Side of Comedy, so I was dual shooting that. So the guy that was shooting recreations went in for color grade instead of both of us.
Okay.
But in that scenario, I would just go in for color grade. Usually on the documentaries I'm more close to, the director and I are very close to the project, so they do value my opinion and they'll show me rough cuts, and we do go back and forth, and I appreciate that relationship and that, you know, kind of conversation of letting me have some feedback in it. But, you know, because I was there, so I understand what's happening, and they trust my perspective too, which is kind of cool, but it's not always the case. But yeah, usually I'm involved in the color grading side of things on projects like that. And then tourism commercials, I have no say. Like I don't get the same thing as the commercial folks were saying, like I rarely get invited to the commercial grades. Yeah. Or if I do, I'm like, damn, I'm busy on something else. Or the colorist is a friend and they're like, come in. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that in the doc world, you get to be a little bit more involved in that collaboration and team. But I mean, yeah, when you get into the commercial space, it's just like everything's kind of separate and people have moved on. Want to talk a little bit about finding that story, because I think we're all tasked with this idea of like stories are everywhere. And you know, there's so many people that you could tell a story to or about. And how do you decide which is the one that you're going to go forward with? This is the one that you're going to put your money and time and thoughts into, you know, with all of the ideas you might have on the board.
Think about that a little bit. I think first of all, if you're going to be committing so much of your time in your life to something, you personally as a director have to find meaning in the story. So that's like the first basis to weed out all the cool stories. I mean, I meet cool people all the time, you know, and I'm like, wow, it would be awesome if someone made a doc about you. But it wouldn't be me because I don't feel the same level of connection as and it, you know, it's different if you're directing for an unscripted thing that you didn't pitch, right? Like, but I think that within all stories, there is something that is special to you. And finding out what is special in that story to you as a person is likely what's also special to at least 50% of the other people who are talking to this person. And getting to the heart of why this person is so cool. It's not enough to be like, this is a cool thing. What does it mean? What does it mean in the person's personal life, in the life of, like, in their societal context? You know, what's the larger meaning behind the story? Let's say, for example, if I'm going to talk to a woman about, I don't know, let's pick something about chair making. Like, we could just do a straight up documentary about a woman who makes a chair, but what are the larger connections in making a chair? When you're making a chair, you are connecting different bodies together of wood. There's a lot of hard work that goes into shaving. I don't know anything about chair making. I'm making this up. But, there are I'm trying to describe...
shooting it. I can always see shooting it.
I'm trying to describe the connections between making a chair and, for example, like, let's say she really enjoys collaborating with other people in ballroom dancing. There are so many levels that you can connect those two things together. Collaboration, many parts coming together. What's the larger like societal context? Why would someone want to watch a woman making a chair? Independence. She's strong, like female figure working in a industry that you don't see a lot of. Where's the heart in it? Oh, it comes from this and this. You talk about her childhood. What drives her to want to make this chair? There's all these questions that I'll ask from the subject and start to think about these connections to draw out that meaning. And the other thing too about documentaries, personally, that I find is really important is sometimes things don't have to be literal, right? Like, you can pair someone talking about a chair to some B-roll and some visuals of, her working with her team or collaborating with her team. And as she talks about putting the parts of the chair together, you see her team working together, and then you really feel what the deeper meaning behind this film is not about the chair, but it's about working together. So there's always some kind of thing that you can pull out from it. And I'm sure, like, Christina, you can talk a little bit about that visual language too, of how you can use stuff to mean other stuff to bring out the story.
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes from, talking to the director from what they've established so far, but I think the most important thing in documentary is to stay curious. So you might think something might go one way, but if you are just so focused on forcing something to happen, it's not going to happen. So you have to really keep curiosity alive when you're approaching a set, even on any set you're on, and just be adaptable. And as a cinematographer, I visually am finding those smaller moments in the human experience, like how someone might move their hand, or like the way their shirt's wrinkled. Like, there's textures, there's stories on people's faces. Like, when you're shooting commercial work or narrative work, everyone's trying to make everyone look the best. They're very made up. They're in character. Sometimes they have heavy makeup on because that's what the character is, or like you can't even see the actor's face because it's covered in makeup and stuff. Costumes are very pristine and like intentional, but like, this is a real human, and from what they're wearing to like how their hair might be kind of funny, or like the wrinkles on your face, that's all story. That's all telling so much about that person in that moment. How they fidget, how they sweat a little bit, like, that's so much interesting things happening in front of my camera, and I try to capture as much of that as possible, in relation also to the story as well.
All right, quickly, favorite doc of all time.
Oh, that's hard.
I mean, I'll say, I think there's too many, obviously, to pick one, but one of the ones I think resonated with me the most when we talk about visual and like story was, I never really cared about rock climbing, but for some reason, Free Solo,
I'm a rock climber.
it was like one of those things where I was on the edge of my seat, and not because I really cared about, is he gonna make it to the top, but I cared about that story. And to sit through 90 minutes of watching a documentary about climbing a wall, I think, to me, was one of the films that I was most interested in. And I mean, now there's just endless docs on Netflix that are so amazing. But I'm curious, favorite doc from each of you?
I'm a big nature of things fan, so I love like nature docs because I just think it's incredible what people do to get shots of animals in nature. I wish I could do more of that. I used to do some of that when I lived in Alberta. So like, I'm just like anything Nat Geo, anything like major nature docs are like something I really enjoy, because it's just incredible, the cinematography that comes out of it, because it's just pure visual, and then the patience that goes into capturing some of those animals that are more elusive, or just hiking up a freaking mountain, because I've done it with a F55 and an ingenue lens on my back, to get a shot of like a certain tree growing at a certain altitude is insane, and it's so satisfying, and to experience that and know what those people went through to get those shots, I just find incredible. So I like anything of that nature.
Amazing. Amanda?
I don't know about favorite doc, but I'll list two. One is the doc that I saw at Hot Docs that made me want to go into documentary in many, many years ago. It's called Vivan las Antipodas, and it's about antipodal cities which is like if you imagine the Earth, there's a city on one side, you draw a line, and the city on the other side. And the visual language in this documentary, go and watch it. There's these scenes where they would shoot it, and then it would turn completely upside down because you're looking at the globe on the other side, and they would cut in between two different cities like that. Incredible cinematography.
Amazing.
And
what was the second one?
My second one I just saw last night, actually. It made a really big impression on me. It's a Canadian film. It's called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's Kitezoa, Kitezoa. It was nominated for a Canadian Screen Award.
Wow.
And it's about Haiti and the people and the culture there, and beautiful cinematography. Felt like you're really, really there during Carnival, and it was wonderful. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, let's open it up to some audience questions for those of you that are curious about making docs or getting your doc funded or just getting started making a story. Questions for our two panelists. See a hand back there, yeah.
If you've ever interviewed somebody for a documentary and they give a boring answer respectfully, or an answer that seems forced for the camera, how do you deal with that? How do you get them comfortable in giving the best authentic answers?
That's a great question. That has so many answers, I think. I think from the beginning, part of the research and pre-interview that I do when I talk to someone on the phone is, can they speak? If they're speaking to me on the phone and they're only giving me one-word answers, I know they're probably not going to be a good subject for camera, so I don't pursue that route. If they're really great on the phone, but they're just the type that's camera shy, I think getting them comfortable in front of the camera is really important. Taking breaks in between, hiring a good crew that makes them feel comfortable, maybe having a smaller crew, sometimes you can kind of ask people to leave the room, and it's just you, the director, and them speaking, so it feels a little bit like you're on your phone when you're talking to them on the phone. I think a lot of times when people have to look directly into camera, that's when they get scared too. So having them speak to you a little bit, like you sit next to the camera and have them speak directly to you, forget that there's a camera, that could really help too. And breaking questions down into very bite-sized questions, or asking them easy questions to start out with first, like, what's your dog's name? Tell me about your son, and ask them something that they love that's totally unrelated. Get them talking first, and then once they're comfortable, they'll just go.
A couple tricks that we do is we keep it conversational instead of question one, read the question, make it a conversation so that they don't actually realize they're being asked a question because you're just talking to them about stuff. If they suck at the beginning, ask the question later, once they're more comfortable. We always get people to do their intro later again because they're sitting down for the first time, they're very anxious, so their intro always sucks. The first one or two questions is not always great, so we always re-ask those questions at the end when they're much more comfortable. And yeah, as a cinematographer, I definitely get the biggest compliment I get is they forgot I was there. So I feel like I did my job as a DP if they actually forgot I was there, because I either hide behind the camera so they don't see my eye line, or I'm just being that much of a fly on the wall that they actually can be their authentic self and they forget about me and they're more focused on whatever they're doing or talking to the director. So that's my job, is to keep them in their bubble so that they can have a conversation and they can talk as authentically as possible, because it's hard not to see the camera, when it's in your face. We also have this great thing called the eye direct that you can put in front of a camera and you can see the director's face on the camera. So if you want them to look right into the lens, that's another option as well.
Question, yeah, go ahead.
Do you create a lookbook for the project before the documentary, or that's something that goes
Yeah, if the director usually sends me a couple references of stuff they like. Regardless of the project, I'm always asking my directors to send me references. So photography, obviously any kind of films that you like that you want to try and emulate, 100% send me that. I'll start building a lookbook regardless, because I want to make sure we're on the same page of what we're going after, especially the language of like, when are we going to be wider? Do we want to be more intimate? Is this going to be handheld? When do we want to do we want to have a dolly or some other kind of movement? Like how are we using movement and in the language of it too? Because it could be really jarring to go from a really static film to all of a sudden something very handheld if we haven't done it for the majority of the film. Is that intentional? Like that's all stuff that we're talking about. So it's really important to have that essential breakdown, even if it's not like a fancy lookbook, just having those conversations. So it is definitely important.
Before we even start having these conversations too, I think it's always great when directors create a treatment. Mm-hmm. So then you know where my head is at when we start to even talk about what it looks like. And a treatment, I mean like a visual and audio treatment. How do I want it to sound like? How do I want it to look like? All those type of things.
Yeah, sometimes I'll even like I do it more for narrative, but in certain documentaries that are a bit more involved, like we'll make playlists. Like I'll create a Spotify of like how does this feel? Like how is the character supposed to feel? Or like what's the film's tonality? Like if you can't describe it in words, like assemble a playlist with me. Like this is what, as I'm reading the script or as I'm looking at the treatment of what we're trying to capture, these are the sounds of what I might hear happening. Because like you might not get the rights to a soundtrack, but there's always music in a lot of these projects. So it's like what's the tonality? Especially like if I'm doing something about music, like a music project, like if it's a country music documentary, like obviously that's pretty clear what we're doing there. So there's going to be a theme, but like maybe they want to shoot it like more rock metal heavy intense and not like the classic cowboy look, like these are conversations we have to have because it all affects how we shoot it.
Amazing. What we are going to do is, I'm sure there's way more questions for these two because they're filled with answers that I would love for each of you to be able to ask them one-on-one. I'm going to open up the floor to them and say, if you want to come up and ask them questions about their experience shooting, directing, writing, creating a story, come and have those conversations. That's really what today is about, is building that community and networking with people. Just in closing, I'm going to say today's event, if you weren't here for the beginning of it, is really about bringing filmmakers together. Whether you're shooting commercials or you're shooting narrative or you're shooting documentaries, I mean, we're all here because we love some form of storytelling. And I just want to thank all of you for coming to today. I want to thank our panelists that we've had so far. And again, I just want to thank my team. So thank you both very, very much.
Us.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.